The chamber stretched for almost a kilometer, its crystalline walls reflecting the light of 1,000 worlds. Representatives from across the galaxy filled the tiered seats, their forms as varied as the stars themselves. Some breathed oxygen, others methane. Some stood on legs, others floated in suspension fields. But today, they all stared at the same holographic display with identical expressions of disbelief. Counselor Thane of the Consensus checked his data pad for the 7th time. The numbers hadn't changed. He looked up at the massive display showing the Universal Sacrifice Registry and felt his breathing sacs constrict. This couldn't be right. Archivist, Thane's voice echoed through the chamber. Please confirm the accuracy of these figures. The archivist, a being of pure energy contained within a geometric field, pulsed with what might have been annoyance. The data has been 3 times, Counselor. The Universal Sacrifice Registry does not make errors. It has not made an error in 10,000 years of operation. Ambassador Way of Earth sat in the human delegation section, confused by the sudden tension in the room. The millennial census review had been routine so far. Population numbers, technological indexes, cultural development markers, all standard stuff. Then they'd reached the sacrifice statistics, and the entire council had frozen. Perhaps, suggested Counselor, her scales rippling with agitation, there is a translation error. The humans may not understand what constitutes a voluntary emergency death. Wei stood, her movement causing several nearby delegates to flinch. She still wasn't used to that reaction. Excuse me, but what exactly is the problem? Thane turned to face her. His large eyes, adapted for the dim light of his, widened further. Ambassador, according to the registry, humanity has logged 47,812 voluntary emergency deaths in the 347 years since your first contact with galactic civilization. Wei waited for the rest of the statement. When none came, she shrugged. Yes, that sounds approximately correct. Is there a discrepancy? A ripple of shock moved through the chamber like a wave. Several delegates made gestures that their translators couldn't interpret, though the meaning of distress came through clearly. Ambassador, Thane said slowly, the combined total for all other member species across the past 10,000 years is 31,906. Wei blinked. She did the math in her head, then checked it again. I'm sorry, Counselor, but are you saying that humans account for more than half of all recorded voluntary emergency deaths in the entire galaxy? 60%, the archivist interjected, to be precise. But we've only been members for 3.5 centuries. Yes. Wei sat down slowly. Around her, the other human delegates were murmuring to each other, equally confused. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. She raised her hand again. Counselor Thane, perhaps we should clarify what the registry actually measures. Thane nodded, seeming to collect himself. The Universal Sacrifice Registry was established by the Precursor Council in the year 2847 by the old calendar. It records every sentient being who voluntarily gives their life in an emergency situation to save others, not soldiers in planned military operations, not ritual sacrifices, not accidents. Only individuals who make a conscious choice, in a moment of crisis, to trade their life for another's survival. Right, Wei said, that's what we thought it meant. You understand that this is considered the rarest and most profound expression of sentient altruism? Asked. Most species experience perhaps one such incident per century, if that. It contradicts every biological imperative. Self-preservation is fundamental to evolution. But people are in danger, Wei said simply. Someone has to help them. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual whisper of translation devices ceased. Finally, Counselor Thane spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Ambassador, in my species' entire recorded history, spanning 7,000 years, we have exactly 43 entries in the registry. You claim humanity adds that many every 3 years. Wei did some quick mental math. Actually, counselor, I think we average about 138 per year, but that's just the ones the registry counts. There are others that probably don't meet the exact criteria. A delegate in the back row made a sound like breaking glass. His translator identified it as a scream of distress before shutting off entirely. Medical drones immediately swarmed to his position. Thane raised his hand for order. This session is recessed. The Council will convene an emergency investigation committee. Ambassador, you and your delegation will remain available for questioning. As the chamber emptied, Wei sat with her fellow humans, all of them looking as confused as she felt. Dr. James, the delegation's cultural, leaned over. Did we just accidentally terrify the entire galaxy? I think so, Wei replied, but I have no idea why. 3 days later, Wei found herself in a smaller conference room facing a panel of ethicists and military strategists. Counselor Thane led the questioning, his demeanor formal but his eyes betraying deep unease. Ambassador, we need to understand the context of these deaths. Let us start with a specific example. Thane brought up a holographic file. Entry 41,265. Sarah, no relation to you, I presume. Age 27. She died in a factory fire on the colony world of New Perth. The record states she held a support beam for 4 minutes and 18 seconds while 11 escaped. She could have escaped herself. Yes, Wei said. I remember that. It was about 15 years ago. There was a memorial service. Her family received commendations. But why did she do it? Asked, leaning forward. Was she ordered? Of course not. Was there cultural pressure, religious obligation? No, the beam was collapsing. People were trapped, she held it. But she died. Yes, that's generally what happens when you hold up several tons of collapsed machinery. Thane made a gesture of frustration. Ambassador, please understand our confusion. In any other species, the instinct for self-preservation would override such an impulse. She would have calculated that her death was certain and fled. This is rational behavior. Wei felt a flash of anger and let 11 people burn to death. Better one survivor than 12 dead. But there weren't 12 dead. There were 11 survivors and one hero. The word hero caused several delegates to consult their translation devices. Doctor, a renowned, leaned forward. This term hero, it appears frequently in human languages. What does it mean? Someone who helps others at great personal risk or sacrifice, Wei explained. Someone who does the right thing when it's difficult or dangerous. And this is considered positive. Of course it's positive. But they die. Wei took a deep breath trying to find the words. Counselor, do your people have a concept of meaning, of purpose? Naturally. For many humans, there is no greater purpose than protecting others. Parents die for children. Strangers die for strangers. We run into burning buildings, dive into dangerous waters, throw ourselves in front of threats. Not because we're ordered to, but because someone needs help and we can provide it. Doctor was making rapid notes on his device. And this behavior is common, not limited to a specific subset of your population. It's uncommon in that most people never face such a situation. But when they do, yes, it's relatively common. We have entire professions built around it. Firefighters, lifeguards, emergency responders, soldiers. We have those professions too, Thane said. But they are trained to minimize risk, to preserve their own lives while helping others. They are equipped with safety protocols. So are ours. But when protocols fail and someone's in danger, humans generally choose to help anyway. Was looking at Wei with an expression the ambassador couldn't quite read. Even for strangers, for people you don't know. Especially for strangers sometimes. There's an old saying, greater love hath no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. but humans have been known to do it for complete strangers, for people they've never met, sometimes even for other species. That statement caused an uproar. Several delegates stood, speaking rapidly in their native languages. Thane called for order, but his own hands were shaking. "You cannot mean," he said slowly, "that humans would voluntarily die for aliens, for species not their own." Wei thought of the memorial on station. A human engineer who'd manually sealed a hull breach, knowing it would trap him in a decompressing section, because 3 children were on the other side. She'd attended the service. The family had wept in a way that transcended species. "Yes," she said simply, we have." Doctor stood abruptly, his data pad clattering to the floor. "This interrogation is concluded. The council must convene immediately. This is beyond our initial assessment." As the delegates filed out, Thane approached Wei. He looked shaken. "Ambassador, I must ask you a direct question. Is humanity dangerous?" Wei considered the question carefully. "Counselor, we're dangerous to threats, to anyone who would harm innocent people, but to innocents themselves," she shook her head. "We're the least dangerous species you could meet. We're the ones who die so others can live." "That," Thane said quietly, "is precisely what terrifies us." He left before Wei could ask him to explain. She stood alone in the conference room, looking out at the stars beyond the window, wondering what kind of galaxy she joined where self-sacrifice was considered terrifying rather than noble. The next morning she received a summons. The Galactic Council was calling an emergency session. The topic, the human question. Wei read the brief and felt her stomach drop. They weren't trying to understand humanity anymore. They were trying to decide what to do about humanity, and the military strategists would be leading the discussion. The numbers on the Universal Sacrifice Registry glowed on her data pad. 47,812. She thought of each one. The firefighter who'd carried unconscious residents down 15 flights of stairs until his heart gave out. The pilot who'd aimed her failing ship at empty ocean instead of ejecting over a city. The doctor who'd stayed in the quarantine zone until the last patient recovered, contracting the disease himself. Heroes, everyone. But the galaxy saw something else. The galaxy saw a species that didn't value its own life. And that, Wei was beginning to understand, was the most alien and frightening thing they'd ever encountered. She straightened her uniform and headed to the council chamber. Whatever came next, humanity would face it the way they faced everything. Together, and willing to pay whatever price was necessary. Even if the rest of the galaxy couldn't understand why. The investigation teams arrived on Earth 3 weeks later. 12 ships carrying researchers from 8 different species, each determined to understand the human anomaly. They spread across the planet and its colonies, embedding themselves in human society with scientific detachment. They would observe, document, and report. Nothing more. Doctor chose to study emergency services in a city called Chicago. He'd selected it randomly from a database, preferring to avoid any location that might have been prepared for alien observation. He wanted authentic human behavior, not a performance. His first day riding along with Fire Station 47 shattered his initial hypothesis. He'd theorized that humans must use chemical or psychological conditioning to suppress their self-preservation instinct. Surely no rational being could overcome such fundamental programming without artificial assistance. The firefighters offered him coffee. They asked about his. They showed him photos of their families. They were calm, friendly, utterly normal. There was no sign of drugging or mental conditioning. They laughed at his suggestion. "Doc," said Captain Maria Santos, a woman with streaks in her hair and burned scars on her arms, "nobody makes us do this. Most of us had to fight like hell to get this job. Competitive exams, physical tests, years of training. We wanted to be here." "But you run into burning buildings," said. "You enter environments that are actively trying to kill you." "Yeah," Santos agreed. because people are inside those buildings. They need help. But you could die. Santos shrugged. Could die crossing the street, could die in my sleep. At least this way, if it happens, it means something. The alarm sounded before could respond. The station erupted into controlled chaos. Firefighters moved with practiced efficiency, donning gear, boarding trucks. Santos turned to, "You coming? Stay close and do exactly what I say." The building was a residential high-rise, 20 stories tall. Smoke poured from windows on the 15th floor. Watch from behind the barriers as humans ran toward the danger. Not walked, ran, with purpose and determination. Santos and her team disappeared into the smoke. Translator picked up radio chatter, calm voices reporting conditions, coordinating efforts. Then, "We've got people trapped on 16, stairwells blocked." Watched through his recording equipment as Santos and 3 others climbed the exterior ladder. The heat was intense even from his position. They were entering an environment that registered lethal on his sensors, but they climbed anyway. 40 minutes later, they emerged with 6 residents. Santos was carrying an elderly human male over her shoulder. Her face was blackened with soot, her movements labored, but she was smiling. "Everyone out," she reported. "Building's clear." That night back at the station, tried to process what he'd witnessed. "Captain Santos, you were in extreme danger. Your life signs showed severe stress. You could have died." "But I didn't," Santos said, cleaning her equipment. "And 6 people went home to their families tonight." "What if you had died? What would your own family have done?" Santos paused. "They'd have grieved. They'd have been sad, but they'd have understood. My daughter knows what I do. She's proud of me. Wants to be a firefighter herself when she grows up." "You're teaching your offspring to engage in life-threatening behavior." "I'm teaching her to help people, to be brave, to do what's right even when it's hard." Santos looked at him directly. "Doc, what do your people teach their children?" Found he didn't have a good answer. Similar scenes played out across the planet. A researcher in Mumbai watched a traffic officer throw herself between a child and an out-of-control vehicle. The officer survived with severe injuries. When asked why she did it, she seemed confused by the question. "There was a child in danger," she said simply, as if that explained everything. In Tokyo, an observer documented a subway passenger who jumped onto the tracks to rescue someone who'd fallen. He pulled the person to safety with seconds to spare before the train arrived. Interviewed later, the man seemed embarrassed by the attention. "Anyone would have done it," he insisted. The checked historical records. In similar situations on other worlds, the standard response was to alert authorities and wait. No one jumped onto the tracks. On New Beijing Colony, researchers watched a construction accident unfold. A crane malfunction sent a load of steel beams toward a crowded marketplace. A human operator named manually overrode the safety systems, redirecting the load toward himself. He died instantly. 47 people in the market survived without a scratch. His funeral drew thousands. His 12-year-old son gave a speech about his father being a hero. The researchers noted that the child showed signs of grief, but also something else: pride. The entire community seemed to view death not as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a sacrifice to be honored. Doctor compiled reports from all the teams. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. Humans weren't conditioned. They weren't forced. They chose this behavior, freely and repeatedly, across all cultures and contexts. The data showed that approximately 1 in every 40 humans would, when confronted with an emergency, voluntarily risk their life for others. The number who would risk serious injury was even higher. More disturbing was the children's education. Human schools taught stories of historical heroes. Children role-played rescue scenarios. Parents read bedtime stories about people who sacrificed themselves for others. It wasn't indoctrination in the traditional sense. There were no punishments for refusing to help, but the cultural message was clear. The highest virtue was helping others, even at cost to yourself. The research teams reconvened at council headquarters, presented their findings to a packed chamber. He looked tired, his usual professional detachment replaced by visible disturbance. "Esteemed council," he began, "we have confirmed that the human approach to voluntary sacrifice is not a statistical anomaly, but a fundamental aspect of their psychology and culture. They are, in essence, a species that is optimized for altruism over individual survival." He brought up video after video. The firefighter entering the burning building, the lifeguard swimming into dangerous waters, the teacher standing between students and a gunman, the pilot staying at failing controls to save passengers, ordinary humans making extraordinary choices over and over again. "They have a term," continued, "first responders. These are individuals who professionally respond to emergencies. Every human city has them. Firefighters, emergency medical personnel, rescue specialists. These professions are considered honorable, desirable. Parents are proud when their children choose these paths." Counselor Thane leaned forward. "And these first responders, they are aware of the mortality statistics." "Yes, human firefighters have a death rate approximately 40 times higher than our own emergency personnel. They know this. They accept it as part of the job." "That's madness," whispered. "That's humanity," replied. "But it extends beyond professionals. We documented ordinary citizens with no special training, intervening in emergencies at great personal risk. A shop clerk who disarmed a robber threatening customers, a teenager who pulled a stranger from a frozen lake, an office worker who gave his pressure suit to a colleague when a colony dome breached, dying so the other could survive." He paused, his voice dropping. "This last example is perhaps most illustrative. The man who gave up his suit, Michael Park, had 3 children. The woman he saved was a stranger he'd met that morning. She was childless. By any rational calculation, his life had more utilitarian value. He gave it to her anyway. When asked why, his last recorded words were, 'She was younger. She had more life ahead.'" The chamber was silent except for the hum of life support systems. Finally, General of the Defense Forces stood. "Doctor, I must ask the question we're all thinking. If humans behave this way in peacetime, what happens in war?" Closed his eyes briefly. "General, I was hopping to avoid this topic, but you're right to raise it. We examined human military history. The results are concerning." He brought up new data. Humans have a military tradition dating back thousands of years. Their warfare is brutal, efficient, and characterized by repeated acts of what they call heroism. Soldiers who sacrifice themselves to save their units, medics who rush into fire to treat wounded, pilots who crash their disabled craft into empty terrain rather than populated areas. The pattern holds across all conflicts. "How many of their military personnel exhibit this behavior?" asked. "In situations requiring such sacrifice, approximately 60 to 70% volunteer. When multiple volunteers come forward, they often argue about who gets to sacrifice themselves." Several delegates made sounds of distress, sat down slowly. "They argue about who gets to die." "Yes, they view it as an honor." Thane stood, his voice strained. "Doctor, I must ask directly. In your professional opinion, does humanity represent a threat to galactic stability?" Was quiet for a long moment. "Counselor, that depends entirely on your definition of threat." The emergency session stretched into its 3rd day. Ambassador Wei sat in the human delegation area, watching the council debate humanity's place in galactic civilization. The arguments were getting heated. "They're unpredictable," argued Counselor. "A species that doesn't prioritize self-preservation cannot be trusted to make rational decisions." "They're dangerous," General added. "If they're willing to die for strangers, imagine what they'd do for allies, or what they'd do to enemies." Thane called for order. "The question before us is clear. Do we restrict human expansion? Do we limit their involvement in council affairs? Do we classify them as a potential threat? Wei had heard enough. She stood and, despite herself, spoke louder than intended. "Excuse me, but I think you're all missing something obvious." The chamber quieted. Thane gestured for her to continue. "You're terrified of us because we're willing to die for each other. Let me ask you something, counselors. What kind of species are you that this scares you?" Scales rippled with agitation. "We are survivors, Ambassador. We are species that have lasted millions of years precisely because we value life, calculate risk, and choose survival." "And how many of you," Wei asked quietly, "would give your life for someone in this room?" The silence was profound. Wei saw the answer on their faces. None of them, or perhaps a rare few for their own kind in extreme circumstances, but the casual, immediate willingness she saw in humans every day. It was alien to them in the truest sense. "You think we're dangerous because we don't fear death," Wei continued. "But you have it backwards. We don't fail to value life. We value it so much that we'll give our own to preserve it. We understand that life is precious, which is why we can't stand by and watch it end when we have the power to prevent it." "Even at the cost of your own?" Thane asked. "Especially at the cost of our own." Before anyone could respond, alarms blared throughout the council station. Emergency protocols activated, and the automated voice announced what everyone already felt through the vibrations. Catastrophic hull breach in Section 7. Decompression in progress. Estimated casualties, 247 beings. The council chamber erupted into controlled chaos. Delegates rushed toward exits, heading for emergency escape pods. Standard procedure dictated evacuation while emergency systems managed the crisis. Let the automated systems handle it. Preserve the leadership. That was the protocol that had saved countless lives across. Wei ran toward Section 7. So did every other human in the building. Security tried to stop them. "Section 7 is compromised. You'll die if you go there." "People are trapped," Wei said, pushing past. "Emergency bulkheads will seal in 90 seconds. That's not enough time for an evacuation." "The automated systems will handle it. The automated systems will seal the bulkheads and save the rest of the station. The people in Section 7 will suffocate. Now get out of my way." Wei and 14 other humans reached Section 7 as the countdown reached 60 seconds. The section was chaos. Debris floated in the partial gravity. Air rushed toward the breach with a scream. Aliens of a dozen species stumbled toward exits, some injured, some panicked. The humans spread out without discussion. They'd all done emergency drills. They all knew what to do. Doctor grabbed a family, 3 of them, pushing them toward the emergency bulkhead. Lieutenant Park, a human military observer, pulled a wounded onto his back and ran. Wei found an unconscious delegate trapped under debris and lifted with strength she didn't know she had. 40 seconds. More humans arrived. They'd come from all over the station. There were 27 of them now, forming a chain, passing injured aliens hand to hand toward safety. Working with the efficiency of a species that had practiced this scenario countless times. 20 seconds. Most of the trapped aliens were out, but not all. Wei saw 3 children huddled in a corner, frozen in fear. The emergency bulkhead was too far. They wouldn't make it. 10 seconds. Wei ran toward them. She grabbed 2, pushed them toward the nearest human, who grabbed them and ran. Wei went back for the 3rd child. 5 seconds. She reached the child, grabbed him. The emergency bulkhead was already descending. She threw the child toward the opening. Human hands caught him on the other side. 3 seconds. Wei ran. She could feel the air thinning. Her lungs burned. 1 second. She dove through the closing bulkhead, and hands pulled her through as it sealed with a final, definitive clang. On the other side, in the safe section, humans and aliens lay gasping. Everyone who'd been trapped in Section 7 was accounted for. Everyone had survived. Wei stood slowly, her legs shaking. She looked around at the aliens they'd saved, saw the expressions on their faces, not just gratitude, something else, something like understanding. Counselor Thane appeared, having returned from the evacuation pods. He stared at the scene before him. 27 humans, all of whom had run toward danger while everyone else ran away. Not one casualty. 247 beings saved. "You could have died," he said to Wei. "Yes. All of you could have died." "Yes. But you ran toward the breach anyway." Wei was too tired for diplomacy. "Of course we did. People needed help." Thane looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something Wei had never seen her do. He bowed, deeply, a gesture of profound respect in his culture. "I understand now," he said quietly, "and I am ashamed." The council reconvened 6 hours later after emergency repairs, but the tone had shifted completely. Thane stood before the assembly, and his voice carried a weight it hadn't held before. "This council owes humanity an apology. We have spent weeks investigating them as if they were a threat, when in truth, they are what we should aspire to be." He gestured to the display showing the Universal Sacrifice Registry. "We looked at these numbers and saw madness. We saw a species with a broken survival instinct. But today, when our station was breached, we ran away. All of us. Following protocol, following logic, following our instinct for self-preservation. And the humans ran toward the danger. They saved 247 lives." Stood, her voice subdued. "The question we should have asked is not, what is wrong with humanity, but what is wrong with us? When did we become species that value our own survival over the lives of others?" Doctor approached the podium. "Esteemed council, I have concluded my research. Humanity is not dangerous to us. They are dangerous to our enemies, and they are the greatest allies any species could hope for, because humans will die for you, not might, not in extreme circumstances. They will die for you even if they've only known you for a day, even if you're a different species, even if you've done nothing to earn it." General stood, and his military bearing was unusually rigid. "The council asked me to assess the military implications of human psychology. I can now provide that assessment. If humans volunteer for death so readily in peacetime than in war, they will be unstoppable. Not because they're better fighters, but because they will never surrender when others depend on them. They will never retreat if it means abandoning allies, and they will never accept defeat if innocent lives hang in the balance." He paused. "Esteemed Council, 6 days ago the Empire sent a probe into Council space, an act of aggression testing our resolve. I propose we do nothing. I propose we let them intercept these proceedings. Let them see what we have seen. Let them understand what humanity is." The motion passed unanimously. 3 weeks later, the Empire sent an official communication. It was brief. "The Empire recognizes the sovereignty of Council space and will not attempt further incursions. We have no wish to engage a civilization that includes humanity." The galaxy had learned a lesson that day. That survival wasn't the highest virtue. That the strongest species wasn't the one that lived longest, but the one that was willing to die for others. And that humanity, for all their strange and frightening ways, had mastered something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. The Council created a new position, the Custodian of Sacrifice. Its purpose was to study and teach the principles humanity demonstrated, to remind galactic civilization that there were things worth dying for. Wei was offered the role and declined. Instead, she recommended they speak to Captain Santos, to the firefighters and teachers and ordinary humans who'd never thought of themselves as exceptional. The Universal Sacrifice Registry remained active, its numbers continuing to climb. But now something else began to happen. Other species started appearing on the list. A merchant who stayed with his damaged ship to send a distress signal while his crew evacuated. A doctor who remained in a quarantine zone. Small numbers at first, but growing. Humanity's defect was spreading, and the galaxy was better for it. Wei stood in the council chamber one last time before returning to Earth. She looked at the display showing the registry, the numbers that had started this entire crisis. She thought of every name behind those numbers, every sacrifice, every life traded for another. Thane approached her. "Ambassador, I have a question. When you ran into Section 7, what were you thinking?" Wei smiled. "I was thinking that I was scared. I was thinking that I wanted to live. I was thinking about my family back on Earth." "Then why did you run?" "Because I was also thinking about those children, and their lives mattered more than my fear." Thane was quiet for a moment. That should not be a revolutionary thought, but it is. "Thank you, Ambassador, for teaching us what we had forgotten." As Wei left the council station, she passed a memorial that had been erected. A simple plaque listing the names of humans from the registry. 47,812 names. Heroes, everyone. Not because they were superhuman, but because they were human. And being human meant running toward danger when someone needed help. It meant dying if necessary. Not because death was glorious, but because life was precious. All life. Even the life of a stranger. Even the life of an alien from a species you'd only met yesterday. The galaxy had called humanity dangerous. They were right, but not in the way they'd feared. Humanity was dangerous to apathy, to the calculation that said one life mattered less than another, to the idea that survival was more important than sacrifice. And slowly, as other species began to embrace that same dangerous philosophy, the entire galaxy began to change. The numbers on the Universal Sacrifice Registry kept climbing, but now humanity had company. And that, Wei thought as she boarded her ship home, was the real victory. Not that humanity was exceptional, but that they'd taught the galaxy that anyone could be.